Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome if you're live with us tonight. And if you're not, then you're not going to see us. You'll see us on catch up as well. I am Big Joe Shep, founder and ChiefBloke of Three Blokes, a Ball and Bod group of live online global rugby shows that we show. You're welcome to tonight's show. We have got the very best referees and TMOs across the globe for you to put your questions, your thoughts, your deliberations, your engagement to. Oh, Jesus, these lads are not only good looking, they're top of their game, and they'll tell you why in a nice, calm, measured manner, like they do on the pitch or like they do in the earpiece, why officiating in the modern game is easy to do. And it's just the rest of us, people like me, ignorant, former props. There you go, Nigel Quigley and David Toppin. I've mentioned that I was a prop once. There'll be at least a dozen times. That's what props do. You're welcome to tonight's show in all seriousness. If you've got questions for tonight, for our guests, then you're welcome. First of all, as ever, we are here at Three Blokes of All about supporting local businesses. Coffeedog.ie have still got their promo on. Go to coffeedog.ie for the best quality in beans and ground coffee, in chai tea and hot chocolate. Use the promo code SHEP, capital letters, SHEP, as in Big Joe Shep, and you'll get 20% off. So thank you to them for all they're doing to support people during COVID themselves. We're also supporting Rugby Academy Ireland, Dan Fonsale, former Springbok, and Johan Taylor and Keith Morris as well, who are taking the next generation of students, pioneering independent international academy just outside Dublin, County Kildare, and they are the people to go to. So rugbyacademyireland.ie. You didn't see last week's show with Dan and Kiva, check that one out as well. And finally, to our friends at Ginako Biltong up in Ulster, the very best in drovers and Biltong, and it's run by two rugby players, Alana and Ilse van Staden, both played for Ulster. Ilse was a former Ireland women's prop as well, so we're supporting them. So there we go. There's our three organisations that we're supporting tonight. Keith, what are we doing? What are we doing tonight? Tell us all about it. Tell us about yourself. Just remind people who you are, the man you are, because he's very unassuming, but he actually is the founder of rugbyreferee.net. But tell us who the real Keith Lewis is.
Hey Joe, well thanks very much for having me back on. It's been a while since the heady ties of Rugby World Cup last year, and it's nice to be back with you.
Yeah, absolutely. How's things going with rugbyreferee.net? How things been going?
It was going fine until this thing happened, and then all of a sudden things slightly dried up. Both obviously here in England, so I'm refereeing down here on the south coast of England. I occasionally get to sit in a TV truck in car parks around the country, but obviously that all came to a grinding halt, similarly to most of the audience that we've got on tonight, who similarly found themselves parked up with not much to do or say. But we've been able to sort of keep things turning over. It's been great to support the guys down under as they get back to the field. So it's great that we've got someone from that end of the woods who can actually remember what it's like to referee. Having done it recently in the last couple of weeks. So we've got Cam Russell joining us tonight. He'll be with us in just a minute. And then also we've got one of my fellow TMOs, former Premiership referee, not something I can say about myself, David Rose, will be with us as well. So yeah, we're going to talk about all sorts of stuff tonight, all linked to refereeing. I think the rugby gods smiled nicely at us last night, where we've had the news out of Dublin and World Rugby that Alain Roland, the head of elite referees, 15 referees, is stepping down by the end of the month. So we can have a chat about that and what we think could be the implications of that, or who we might, which names might be in the frame there. But yeah, so I think we've got, we can cover all sorts of ground between the four of us. Looking forward to seeing some of the questions that we might get in the chat, and we'll see what we've got to talk about.
Brilliant. Introduce our guests, mate.
Yeah, well, let's get them on. I've already given them a bit of a push. So Cam Russell, former teacher turned referee manager down in the Bay of Plenty. Has been doing that for about 4 years now, and is an active referee at the elite level down there. Age grade interprovincial representative rugby. Does a fair amount of ARing and number 4ing, number 5ing, number 6. You even get to number 6, Cam?
Yeah.
In the Mitre 10 Farah Palmer Cups, which is the senior men's and women's competitions down there, which is great. But also as a day job, is involved in overseeing recruitment, retention, development, and education of referees down there. So it's great for that. If anybody has got a law question, Cam is the man to answer it. Don't ask me, I can get round it, but Cam is the man if anyone's got anything to do there. has done some cracking law quizzes with his mob over the last couple of weeks. Cam, welcome to the party.
No, thanks for introducing me there, Keith. It's a pleasure to be on. It's all evening for you guys, but I've got my coffee going, so we're happy days here and looking forward to it.
So, what wine in Dublin, coffee, and whereabouts are you, mate?
I'm in Tauranga in New Zealand.
There you go.
Yeah.
So there we go. And then our second guest is David Rose, who will be a face that many folk on this side of the planet will be familiar with. A Premiership referee for many, many years. 110, I think it was, Rosie, wasn't it?
Yeah. Not
110 Premiership. European as well. Similarly stepped into the TMO world a couple of years ago as well. Still refereeing down in Devon. You are the training manager at the moment?
I'm the secretary now, mate.
Secretary, admin.
Yeah,
big job. But also as a day job in the past has been IRB development manager for the Caribbean, referee development manager, head of development for women and girls rugby at the RFU as well. So we've got a fair amount of bases covered. So Cam, Rosie, thanks for being with us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure.
Cool, guys, just a real pleasure, and thanks to, as Keith says, to Cam and David for joining us. It's been great to chat to you this week. That's again number 2 as a former prop. I never sort of got the whole thing about refs, but we have moved on so much now, and we embrace you. That's why we wanted shows with you. Who have we got on from around the globe? Demo Rourke. Demo, hope that you're well. Evening says, evening guys. Worldwide Rugby Hub to Martin and Chantel. I hope that fantastic site there. Go to Worldwide Rugby Hub and have a look what they're doing. Lots of things coming with the new Hawaiian MLR team. Lots of things coming with the MLR site in there as well. Gerald Williamson, former past president at Navan Rugby Club. Great man, great historian, doing the whole history of every Irish club at the moment. We have him on our Leinster show as well. Eleni in Greece as well, one of the 2 girls in Greece. We're doing a show with Eleni and Penny Mitzi in a few weeks' time on grassroots rugby development, and it would be remiss if I didn't give them a Penny and Eleni a shout out today. Myself and Kigo, I don't know whether you can see that very good there because of my light, but we received these T-shirts from the girls today, which says that you've got to fight for your right to rugby. 2020, sorry, can't pause the game. There we go. Girls, thanks very much for that. We look forward to having you on. Back to tonight's show. Everybody gets a shout out here. You're all welcome. If you have any questions for Keith, for David, and for Cam, please crack on. The very, very best. It's the chance you'll get to ask every single question about rugby and TMOs and how it works, especially with the recent rule changes. Keith's going to lead most of this, but I'm going to start off with the first question because the first one's for Keith. Keith, share with us how the general pathway for becoming a referee or a TMO. Everybody says, I could do better than them. We've shared stuff recently saying to people, well, get off your backside and go and do it in a nice way. But look, there are trial days. But what is the general pathway for being a ref or a TMO, mate?
Yeah, I mean, look, there are many different ways to get into it at the moment. So, I mean, I'll let Rosie tell you his story and Cam's, but I mean, mine was as grassroots as it comes. So I was never going to be a good player. I played at school, did my back in when I was 16, had a change of school, realised that I was actually asked to help out referee some of the inter-house school competitions, got a bit of spare time in my school schedule at that age, and realised that was something I was potentially going to be all right at. So did the course back in Wales. Actually, it was a WRU course. And then I started from the very bottom there and worked up. So I didn't have the rugby heritage that certainly Rosie did. Cam, I'm not sure how you got into refereeing from a playing perspective, but Rosie, I mean, you tell your story. You were, what was it, Walsall and Staffordshire outside half?
Yeah, I mean, I had a long playing career. Played at several clubs, including in and around Birmingham, where I was born and grew up, including Moseley, Wolverhampton, Handsworth was my first club in Birmingham, and finished at Walsall. And played representative rugby as well along the way. And refereeing was never really on my radar. I was working as a development officer, and I met the head of refereeing at the time, who had heard I'd done a little bit of refereeing in some of the trial games we used to run, and I was in his office, and he said to me, "I've heard you've done some refereeing," and I said, "Yeah, it's okay." And I was a real poacher turned gamekeeper. Anybody that played with me or against me will know my views on referees at the time and what it used to be like. And he said to me, "Well, you never made it as a player. You're not going to make it as a coach. So why don't you try refereeing?" And I looked at him, and I won't say what I said to him on this show, but it kind of made me think. And as it turned out, what he wanted to do was break a few of the traditional kind of routes through to refereeing. So I basically was the first referee to get on what was then an unofficial fast track program, and within 18 months, I've made it onto our national panel of referees. Within 3.5 years, I refereed my first Premiership game in 2003. So I had a pretty meteoric sort of route through to the elite level in England. And I must admit, the playing background did help initially. Didn't help ultimately all the way through, but it did help initially.
And how old were you, Rosie? Let's just put an age on it. When you started,
I was 37, I think it was, when I started. So I started, in modern terms, I started late, really late compared to where the guys are now. So I had to get on that treadmill really quickly if I wanted to make it to the Premiership, and I think that's why I got pushed so heavily and so quickly. Because of those two things: one to break the mold, and two because of my age.
Cool. And Cam, what's your refereeing background? You somewhere in the middle of those two?
Well, I'm probably more a bit like you, Keith. I was never going to make it as a player. I actually played when I was in high school, and then a little bit of sevens and whatnot at club. But I actually didn't stop playing rugby and actually played a bit of football for a few years. God help me, and and just where my mates were, and then a few injuries down the line, and as a lot of players, irrespective of code, end up getting, and that's usually what forces them into looking at other things. In this case, my old man was a referee. He refereed locally in Manawatu and North Harbour here in New Zealand, and I'd always had that sort of, I guess, insight when watching the games. He'd always have a good yell at the TV, but it would be in a very pragmatic, law-abiding way that he'd explain things afterwards. So I got a good knowledge for the law just through that. So I just sort of turned up cold one day, and there was a lot of resources online. Sort of went through an online course just by myself before I got into it, and then just picked up the whistle and ran with it. And again, sort of you make it what you want it to be as well. If you pour yourself into it, you can progress, and you can get you can move through the ranks quite quickly if you do pour that sort of self learning into it and that drive. But for our referees here, I can just speak in particular in Bay of Plenty. They come from a range of backgrounds. Most common being either coaches if they're coaching their children's teams. Quite often that's where it begins, and also former players as well. And from a high performance perspective, you've certainly seen high performance players be fast tracked or have that in because they do have that high performance background. They understand the high performance game, the training that goes into it. We've got great examples. I mean, Glenn Jackson was probably the first. Bay Plenty as well. We've got Dan Wang in Hawke's Bay. For the women, we've got Salika Winiata and Tiana Nawati as well. Tiana's here in Bay Plenty. Rebecca Mahoney, former player, and Shane McDermott. So those are probably some of the more notable ones that have come through the ranks in New Zealand.
So I mean that just shows you, Joe, that the difference that we've got in how we get into it. And I think for those out there listening, that we need people of all three varieties, whatever your route into rugby is, we need it. And I think I guess there's a recognition in there that age will limit you. There's the reality of that. People in referee societies will say it doesn't, but in reality, we're trying to service a higher, more professional game. So therefore, the age and the fitness capabilities do play a part as part of that. I think that's one of the other challenges that I guess the new World Rugby chief may have, whoever that might be, is how they get the next lot of referees in. Are they now going to solely focus on players, turning players into referees, At which point, how do you take people who were like me and Cam, who are never going to do that? What's the route? So there's progression issues all the way. But I think from a grassroots level, no matter what background it is, we need you. Whether it's parents who need to referee age grade rugby, youth rugby, whether it's society level, whether it's up to the topper end of the community game into elite. So there's definitely opportunities for that.
And I know that later on we're going to talk about sort of who potential replacements are for Alan is, and have to sort of take our hat off to him, as a player, from Blackrock College originally, and everything he's done for the game has been absolutely superb. So it will be a hard act to follow, but I think the changing times, in the same way as rugby, as we're trying to look now local then global, it's how we inculcate at all levels, at the sort of the grassroots level, the sort of the mid-range level, and the elite level. The very best people like David, who came in relatively late but had a fast track because of probably his age, his experience, and everything else, and took that. But I think there's again, we're going to touch later on with the reduction in funding lines within rugby as a whole. How is that going to affect referees and officials? Coming through. I know New Zealand and Australia already have seen that, but how is that going to affect, and how it will have a dramatic effect? Although I have to just throw this one up for Cam. Joe Lyon says, does Cam get more abuse being a lawyer or from being a ref? Tough call. We'll let you answer that one, Cam.
Oh, well, I mean, I'm a law nut in terms of the laws of the game. Certainly, my background is in teaching. I was a primary school teacher prior to coming into this job. Yeah, but no, and actually, if I think back to whether I caught more abuse as a teacher or as a referee, and that would sometimes be a tight question as well, to be perfectly honest, whether it be from the kids or the parents. But no, I think even if just thinking about the law and applying the law within the game itself, I was actually looking at the question, and I know I'm not actually a lawyer, but if I was a law stickler. That's always an interesting balance as a referee, because you can't be a law stickler and expect to facilitate a decent game. I know the law, but I use it how I need to in a game. I think if you're a law stickler within a game, then you're going to run into some issues pretty quickly.
Absolutely. I think that leads us on nicely, actually, to what does it take, Keith, do you think, to be a referee or to be a TMO in the modern game? Because we're trying to sort of debunk some myths, tonight, and that actually it isn't bloody easy at all. And I know we're going to discuss the difference between Northern and Southern Hemisphere. There's rule changes and all, but in simple terms, what each of you, we'll start with you, Keith. What does it take to be a ref or a TMO in a modern game at any level?
Yeah, well, let's take the ref. I'll let Rosie answer the TMO one. I think from that perspective, I think anyone refereeing, we're there to help the game happen. We've got the law book, which, of course, as Cam just said, is full of stuff that we're never going to use. It's the skill is more about knowing which bit to apply in each bit of a game that you're going to come across as it happens. And that's a really tough thing to develop. When you've got people coming into the game who perhaps haven't played, how they develop that nuance and understanding of what's in front of them is the killer point. I think the other thing is having the type of person who can manage people through that process is the second thing. So people hark back to the days of Clive Norling and Roger Quittington on our side of the planet, Tony Spreadbury. His approach on the field is very different to some of those, and that how they manage the players, how they interact with those players, how they use humour or don't use humour. Obviously, examples on at the moment with St Nigel. And how he delivers all those one-liners, and from the comedian perspective, which is, of course, what people need to remember. He is the comedian outside of that. He is a performer, and how all those attributes that people might have, how they bring that to the field to get a good game of rugby out of it. That's I think, other things that people need to think about. So, Rosie, do you want to pick up the how do you end up in the truck question?
How do you end up in a truck? Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think one of the key things about being a TMO is actually keeping your finger off the button. And and it's often very tempting to get involved, and it's very similar to refereeing on the field, actually, because you don't need to get every single thing right. There's no expectation, even though you've got technology there, to get every single thing right, that people think, why didn't you get that? Why didn't you get that? Why didn't you get that? I think it's about the big picture stuff. It's what are the things that everybody's going to be talking about. We had a couple of conversations earlier, offline about, those things. And what are the things people are going to be talking about? What are the expectations of people who are watching the game, playing the game, the guys on the pitch are officiating, coaches who are sat on the sideline? The role is about meeting those expectations as well as supporting the guys on the field. And I use that word. The key word there is supporting the guys. We are there to help get the right decisions at the right time, not to get every decision, because that's just not logical. That's just, as Cam said, you'd never stop-start game. You'd never get anything going. I was told years ago by a really good mentor that I had, and he gave me this Latin phrase called the minimus non curat lex. And roughly translated, it means the law does not concern itself with triviality. And that's a really interesting way to approach refereeing on the pitch, probably more so than TMOing, because you're expected to get a lot of things right because you've got technology. But what are those right things? Who's saying what's right, what's wrong? The key thing is, making sure that we're there to support the guys on the pitch as far as I'm concerned.
I guess, Cam, when looking at your recruitment view, your recruitment role, what are you looking for when you're trying to attract people into the refereeing ranks?
I suppose the willingness, first of all, to actually pick up the whistle. It's always a good start. But I think probably one of the hardest things to teach or to instill in people is those interpersonal abilities, the ability to connect with people and to stay cool under pressure and be able to explain yourself to someone, or just to manage people. So certainly, police, teachers are probably high target areas in terms of recruitment. Those backgrounds lend themselves to conflict resolution on a day-to-day basis. Those are the core skills, really, that if you're a policeman or a teacher or anything like that, and you haven't thought about refereeing before, then do seriously think about it, because you actually harness already a lot of the hardest skills to learn as a referee. Learning the law is relatively easy. It can be studied. Anything like that can be picked up, and you can pick that up, in a heartbeat if you put your mind to it. It's the practice of those interpersonal skills, which probably takes a bit more time, and is still being perfected by people right to the highest level of the game. And you'll see it in a vast, applied differently right across our elite referees around the world, as well, and players will tell you that as well.
Interesting point there. That was Gerald Williamson, obviously sort of player and sort of former past president of an Irish local club. A good way for a young guy to get into refereeing is to have a mentor referee on the sidelines. Do Cam, in your role and Keita, do you experience any of that? Do you have a mentor system to be able to try and bring people on, or is it just a little bit of because of the necessity? People are sort of thrown in, do the course, and they're assessed, but not necessarily mentored as much as perhaps you would like them to.
Well, we've had varying degrees of this over the years. I'll just speak from a Bay Plenty perspective, at least. When I first started refereeing, I was out there by myself mostly. We had some referee coaches who would dip in and out and provide some support. I undertook a massive review with our referees at the end of last year. I did about 50-odd one-on-one meetings and just really drilled down into what referees want and what's going to build our club. And we refer to our referees association as a referees club rather than an association. So, we're a club just like any other sports club. And once you start building that sense of the club, then people start working for each other. In a club, you have coaches and managers and support for the players, and everyone works together to achieve the same outcome. So we're trying to drive that sense of club within our own referee association. So funnily enough, in a week and a half, we have junior and secondary school rugby kicking off here in the Bay of Plenty. So for a lot of referees, new ones in this year, this will be their first run around on the paddock. And so a mentor system is pretty massive for us. We've identified that as a pretty key area. So we've got a lot of interest from experienced referees willing to help out. We're taking the lead from some other associations, from ideas around the place, things like either just being on the sideline or just checking in ahead and after the game, even shadow refereeing in some respects. So depending on the level and the want and need of the referee who is climbing into it, we're going to have people running around from 14 years old and then running their first game to 45, 50, 55 years old running their first game. So it takes a varying amount, but certainly having a mentor in some capacity is a massive important thing for beginning referees.
It's hugely important. I mean, for me, having just somebody you can talk to when you're going in those first couple of games you're doing, having somebody consistently there is crucial. Now there's the reality of life now. Then perhaps, Rosie, with your Devon hat on, David, whether you want to kind of explain the challenges that we have in finding getting people, volunteers to do it. That's the problem we have, David.
Yeah, it is, and it's an ever-growing problem in trying to get people into refereeing, and I think it varies as well. We're in a rural county, so we have logistical challenges with getting people to matches and getting around the county, and also the number of club teams that have gone, which again reduces your pool of talent that you can go at. So what we've done, like a number of sites, I'm sure Keith's done the same, is we've developed a young match officials program that a few societies started independently, and the RFU picked up in the last few years and incentivized societies to, target young people, boys and girls, to get into officiating, and that's getting some really good traction across the country. Some places better than others, admittedly, but it's getting somewhere. And those young people, what we've done is we've assigned every young referee a mentor, so that or a coach, depending on what that person's skills are. So they always have somebody with them as one of the commentators said, on the side of the pitch, helping them, and as Cam talked about with what they're doing in the Bay of Plenty. So I think there's some similarities taking place that help us produce that next kind of generation of referees. And in England, one of our professional referees, Craig Maxwell Keys, he came through a club referee academy at his junior club in Lichfield in the West Midlands in Staffordshire, and he came through the game. He got injured playing. Didn't like it because it hurt, and Craig will openly admit that he didn't like getting hit. His older brother or younger brother still takes the mickey out of him about it now. But Craig decided he wanted to be in the game, and the refereeing was his route. So the 12, 13-year-old, he was refereeing 3-4 times a week. By the time he made it through to being a Premiership referee, probably done 300 or 400 games of refereeing by the time he got there. So and it shows. And he went through that journey from being very much about the laws of the game, and as a young fella, that was easy for him to referee the law rather than trying to do too much management, because as a young fella, he was going to take any notice of you. So it was really good. So we have got systems in place, but there's still huge challenges.
I guess I'd use this, Joe, for anyone out there watching, to encourage anyone who does watch a lot of rugby, even who hasn't been a referee, to kind of take ownership of those guys that you see and girls that you're seeing out on your parks, to support them, because having the wise counsel, some of the names you just talked about, asking the questions here today, they're great rugby minds, and we could use their skills and their love of rugby to help our referees as well. It doesn't have to be a referee society thing or a coaching side of thing. Let's bring it all together and see how we make it work.
I'll just back onto that one there, Keith. Yeah, 100%. The one thing we lack and the one thing we struggle for the most is developing referee coaches and those mentors and support network. We do have some quality ones here in the Bay of Plenty, but we've got 130 registered referees here and 10 referee coaches, and the numbers don't really fit too well. So anyone with that background in the game still has a lot to contribute.
No, I'd agree with that. We have the same challenges around the numbers of people to support a mentor or coach, and that's probably the biggest barrier to getting those young people or any referees through to the level they want to get to as quickly as they can.
Absolutely. I think it's also how early you start them. If you're inculcating the youngsters that are coming through and explaining to them, maybe sort of 5 minutes in each sort of hour session, of the kids, even tiny when they're running around, just explain what, because kids soak up information. And if you tell them something when they're young, for me, if you tell a kid when it's young, okay, you put a bit of fun around a bit of a guideline or one of the laws or something, and get them to sort of practice it, they'll remember that, and it will soak in. And as they go up, I think we expect players just to play. We expect coaches to coach. We expect refs and TMOs to be sort of there. And it's like, well, what's most important, especially in grassroots, or if you like, sort of mid-level rugby, where somebody is focused on the strength and conditioning, on the fitness, on the playing, on the tactics and everything else. And, well, it's up to you to take the ownership of responsibility for the laws as well. But, inculcate it a little bit and make it fun from the ground up and in every session.
There is another bit to that, Joe, which I think gets missed as well, which is, and you touched on it there, and Cam touched on it, in terms of everybody thinks the fun part of rugby is the playing. And I think, I've really enjoyed my playing days, and nothing will replace, the buzz and the thrill of being in that team. But in terms of getting to be an elite level performer, a referee's journey is probably no different to a player's journey. You've still got to have the physical capabilities. You've still got to have the mental capabilities to be able to absorb information and go out and perform under pressure. You've still got to have the desire to go out and train, and this will be on your own largely in awful conditions and whatever, with nobody around you. So that's self-motivation you've got to have, and then you've got to put all that together and go out and perform under pressure from 30 players and coaches. So actually, from from a developmental and personal perspective, the challenge of getting to the top as a referee is probably not much too different to that of a player. And I think if you're willing to embrace that challenge, there's a fantastic journey you can go on, and and experiences you can have. And if you talk to guys who went to the World Cup in Japan, they formed a fantastic team, and you'll have, just like players will, you'll have friends for life. So the two bits we talk about rugby, about friends for life, about all those other bits and pieces that you get, and we largely put that in a playing prism, you can go from a refereeing one as well. So I think people just have to look at it a slightly different way in terms of, what am I going to get out of the game if I don't play or coach?
Yeah, brilliant. I tell you what, sorry, Keith, I tell you what I'd really love. If I was playing now, I would love to have where you've got a training session, you've got local ref comes in, and say this, let's face it, there's 3 or 4 key areas of the game which are nuances and which always cause a bit of contention with people, offside, breakdown, stuff like that, and have the ref there or a TMO there, and have one of the players acting as the ref. So where they're going through the plays and the tactics, getting the player to say, okay, what's wrong there? Because actually, what a fab way of inculcating that into your training, because a player is going to understand and remember if he has to be the ref on that thing. Do we do much of that where refs and TMOs go and do sort of training days?
We always encourage referees at society level everywhere to get down to a local rugby club and get involved with what's going on, because that is the only way that we can explain and learn, and that's where the rugby is. We can't turn up to a game once every week and that's the only time we touch rugby. Those training sessions are so powerful, and it happens, I guess, unseen by most people out there. And I don't know at what level that still happens, but we know that within our group in the Premiership, that the referees go into clubs on a structured basis to work with them on drills and areas of the game. So it happens all the way through. We know from the World Cup that the likes of John Lacey and Chris Pollock were involved with developing the I know we're not supposed to use the terms now, the tier 2 nations, to help them step up their knowledge by getting them in there. So that's definitely something that is encouraged by all of us at ground level, and happens up the food chain as well.
Good, brilliant. Okay. I think there's lots of potential across the board, and I think people are trying very, very hard. I bet it's like everything, isn't it? It's resources and it's time and buy-in at all levels. And I think there would be some clubs or some individuals just, well, ref turns up the weekend, should know there should be the same consistency across the board. That's the failure. It just doesn't. The reality doesn't meet that. I think it's we've got a couple of points up here which I'm going to come back to, but in fact, I'm going to throw these up. But in the meantime, I do want to. You'll all have had your funniest moments, and you'll all have had a cringiest moment. And I'd like each of you to share a little bit of those with us. Joe Lyons, though, in the first, though, says ex-players that have had their careers cut short through injury, a bit like Alan Rowland. Yep. Martin Buggy, youth coach here in Ireland, and one of our regular panelists. He says, I think getting people into officiating is probably the hardest aspect of rugby. I personally couldn't do it. I'll stick to coaching. But I have found the people that do take it on have a passion for it. It can be a thankless job, absolutely. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. For massive respect, though, for our officials. They're vital for the game. Joe Lyons, can't have a game without them. Maybe the 30 lads and ladies on the park should think about that, as well as the coaches as well. There we go. So, Keith.
I was going to say, can we just bring, there was a previous one from Gerald, I think he's made a couple of comments, but about getting people players to think about becoming officials, which is a really good point, and we kind of touched on it earlier. But that's as bigger. Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, Joel, there. So guys and girls who might not make it as players, but they should be encouraged to think about becoming referees to stay involved. That's a rich vein of talent that we'd love to get our hands on as referees. But it's how we have those conversations, whether, and this is where I'm slightly critical of the structures around the game. I can't speak elsewhere, but we don't seem to have the resource, the capability of getting involved in those conversations. We know that union resources are being stripped back all the time. We're seeing it in England now. You guys have just been through it, Cam, where there's only so much resource. It's being stripped back and it's being reduced all the time. And that's the rich seam that we just can't get into because we haven't got the resource to do it.
We've tried to build that capacity a little bit here in Bay of Plenty, just by having a referee liaison, or for lack of better words. Within our ambition is to have one in every single club in the school within the Bay, which is about 100 and something odd. But just having a connection point within the club, so they can actually be part of the club themselves or the school. Pick up any of the people who are just doing the mum and dad refereeing for under sixes on a Saturday morning. Connect with those players who they know might be in the Premier team or coming finish playing, and trying to connect, actually be a part of that club, to then bring them into our club as well. So that's part of our ambition, and that's what we're starting to lift off the ground this year. So now that the season's starting to roll on, we'll hopefully start to see the payoff of that pretty soon.
Wouldn't it be fab for you're right, wouldn't it be fab for every club at every level to have almost an officiating liaison officer, somebody who is the go-to person within the club for the coaches and the players, for somebody who might not be a ref, but has done the, sort of a week-long ref course or an officiating and law type course, so understands it more and is in contact with you're a referee manager for Bay of Plenty in New Zealand, so it's a big regional union. So if you had something like that in every club, it's got to be great for being able to cross-fertilize information.
It's about those connections. Like, I can't reach those people by myself. And as far as we can spread referees and integrate referees, integration is one of our key things that in fact, it was the primary, I guess, buzzword that we came up with when we did our strategic review this year, is integration. And how can we integrate into rugby and actually become more a part of rugby, and with the clubs and with the players and with the coaches. And that's key for us.
I think that's a really good point, Cam, that you make there, is that for too long, refereeing hasn't been seen as part of the game and not connected. It's been seen as kind of like that bit that's out there that nobody wants to go into, and it's kind of these weird people that turn up, do a game, go away, and then they turn up. Somebody else turns up the following week, and he's even more weird, or she's even more weird. It is kind of that disconnect that the game has always tended to have, and I think that's a really good point about. And you can pick up on all kinds of different threads and stuff, but there's some real key sort of things coming through here about connection, around personality, around enjoyment and stuff like that. And I mean, Keith probably said the same thing. Back in England years ago, it used to be compulsory that every season, every club had to provide at least one referee to its local society, and it was kind of a prerequisite that you had to do. And everywhere you went, there were guys who were in their club and every club had a referee. So it wasn't quite formal like Cam's talking around in terms of that liaison bit, but at least in every club, and go back to your point, Joe, had somebody on a Saturday when the boys were in the bar, they could go to and say, "Hey, today we had this referee who did this. Can you explain, what was going on?" And it helped. And I think, sometimes you throw the baby out of the bathwater in terms of what we call progress. When actually you look back, sometimes there might be some really good ideas and things we used to do that we no longer do, that we could, go back to and say, why not try that again?
God, Jesus, I can get me jacket and leave now. That I was actually positivity to the officiating circle tonight, gentlemen. Before we go on to your funniest moments, though, sorry for nicking off your show, Keith. Steve Newton from the England Rugby Supporters and the new fantastic roaring forwards British National Lines 21 forum. Have a look at that. That's good. Steve and Nick are doing that. Nice to see that the refs have been directed to be more strict on the current laws that have been disregarded too long. Again, I'm wondering whether sometimes interpretation, gentlemen, Joe Lyons agrees with them. I love the little side conversations. Yeah, absolutely. Bloody right. What are these refs and TMOs? No.
Should we get into that, Joe?
Yeah, I think so, mate, because I think it's a very emotive thing, Keith.
Yeah, look, I mean, we saw just as lockdown was kicking off that World Rugby had made the pronouncements of the changes in the direction of what was going to happen as to how particularly the breakdown was going to be refereed, and the focus was. I think there'd been a working group going on. For those of you who didn't see that, there's a working group of coaches, players, medics to some extent as well, and referee looking at this real deep dive level to figure out whether we needed to change the law to bring the law up to what the game was like, or whether we take the game back to the law. And we talked about this during the World Cup last year. And having looked at all that, rather than scrapping laws and changing the law altogether, they've all decided collectively that the best thing to do is that we take the game back to the law. And we referee. And over years, we all know that things have crept in, and it's just been allowed to happen. And suddenly we get to a stage where we've got crocodile rolls being in there, and players being injured, and all the sorts of things that go with that. And no one could really come up with a way of addressing that. So the only way to do that is to reinforce what we were going to do, which is very much the point that that comment just made, is that we go back. So the priority areas that we're looking to do is to reward that jackal. With power, because in theory, if the jackal is there and on his feet, which is a key point, or her feet, they get the ball. There shouldn't be an issue where they don't get it.
Yeah.
I think we'd all argue, looking at clips from at pro levels, where we get that jackal there and they're not actually trying to get the ball at all. They've got arms on somewhere. They're actually holding the ball in. They're not trying to get it. So there's a bit of kidology all round there. But the other focus that's coming on, and we're starting to see through the Super Rugby restart, is where that tackler is now being asked to go. In other words, to get right out of the game and to roll towards the sideline. And that's, I think, will be a really interesting thing to see develop. I mean, Cam, you've probably seen that on the part. We haven't seen that up here yet. We're looking forward to seeing that how it comes through. But those are the real things that they're looking to address, to make sure that the tackle is refereed as it was intended to be refereeing. Yeah. And when we make those sudden switches, we suddenly become enemy number one. I think we saw Super Rugby Aratoa weekend one. The penalty count was north of 30 on both the games.
30 and 31, yeah.
31. So it's, I mean, that's a horror story waiting to be written in the media at a normal game like that. But that's what we're going to see as we all get used to that change of behaviour from the players, and then we actually referee it as well. So that's what we're now being asked to see. I mean, Cam, how have you actually seen it at your level, and are you refereeing just those law changes at community level at your end of the woods, or are you doing some other stuff as well?
Yeah, no, it's been a really interesting. We're 3 rounds into our senior competition here, plus a couple of preseason games. So I've refereed about 4 or 5 games now at a good level with these law focus areas, I guess you can put them. We haven't adopted any law changes or amendments at community level in New Zealand, but we have certainly adopted those same focus areas as Super Rugby, particularly the breakdown, and also managing offsides, that players are now clearly onside rather than not. And it's amazing how, just as a referee, it's actually just changed, I guess, what we call our pictures. It's made them a heck of a lot clearer. It's made the process so much more streamlined. So now that we have some real focus areas, and we actually are expected to rule on those, we've made it remarkably clear with the teams. Well, I don't know, just within here with our top level teams, we held development sessions and Zoom sessions, explaining, discussing what they're going to be, unpacking them. And we've had, again, referees connecting with clubs and teams where possible ahead of the season, just to work through them at trainings. And there was a bit of bedding in, of course, the first couple of weeks, once the teams actually started to realise that you're being serious and you actually were going to do what you said you're going to do. They've actually started to adapt and react and change behaviours. So already, like, I remember my first game out there, I think I blew, it was close to about 28, 29 penalties in that first game, and that's down to low 20s now, and that's only in 2 or 3 rounds. So these are just amateur players, so they can show that the adaptation is already there. But yeah, certainly, like I said about those pictures, that getting rid of the tackler and making that the priority is their first focus point. And then once that becomes your first focus point, then everything else becomes quite stepped and streamlined after that. Then it's pretty obvious to see if the ball carrier is going to do an extra movement. That's obvious to see. You don't really need to look for that. But then you can just worry about those arriving players and what they're doing. Are they allowing a fair contest for that ball? And managing offsides, it's super easy. Clearly onside, I just say to them, boys, if you're going to be right on the line, and if I think you might be offside, then I'm going to call you offside. Just take half a step. And it's so easy. And then all of a sudden, you've now got space for the game to operate. And I think I blew 1 offside penalty last week, as opposed to probably 5 or 6 that I might normally blow. And it's fantastic. They know where the boundaries are, and it's actually starting to work really, really well.
It'll certainly be interesting for us when we get back. I mean, we're not even getting close, I don't think, to being back in the game. I think England, Scotland, Wales it's going to be probably after Christmas, I think, in reality, before we get to proper rugby again. There's media reports up this neck of the woods that they're going to bring in a strange variation of non-contact, contact-ish, contact-light game for us to all to do something, just so we're back out doing something. So we'll have to see how that one beds out. Premiership and Championship clubs are back training again, aiming towards, I think, 14th, 15th of August weekend from a Premiership perspective. So they'll be all bedding in with those. The Premiership referee group have been back together again for the first time this week, getting back training. So I'm sure at some point we'll be heading back out to clubs to reinforce the stuff we've all been seeing, and making sure that 14, 15, 16 of August weekend isn't a penalty fest.
And I'll just add one thing to it. I actually don't know, to be perfectly honest, if there's actually been much of a change in community level rugby. For me, a lot of what was identified, particularly in that breakdown, was just through to what was being coached at a high performance level. Yeah. Like I was actually, to be perfectly honest, getting really, really disenfranchised watching Super Rugby last season, just with the number of particularly side entries, and they're basically pretty much cleaning out a would-be jackler from his side almost, and that was, I was just watching it going, this is not what the laws are written for. This is not how we're supposed to apply the game. So I was welcoming those law application guidelines earlier this year. And I think that at a community level, there has been a bit more of a focus on it, but to be perfectly honest, not a lot has actually needed to change, and has changed because actually we refereed quite differently, and players aren't as skillful to, or coached in a certain way to, I guess, more or less cheat, for lack of better words, or bend the laws, I guess, as far as the referee would allow. Probably do that a bit less at community level anyway. Usually, what they do is usually through lack of skill or inaccuracy. So that's probably what we're refereeing on anyway.
Rosie, were you wanting to come in there, mate?
I was just going to, are we going to be in the Premiership, because we're halfway through the competition effectively, using the new tackle variations to finish the season, or are we going to wait till next season to bring that in? There was some discussion initially that I read that Premiership Rugby had said they didn't want anything to change, using that terrible phrase, to preserve the integrity of the competition. Because if that's going to cause confusion for players and the viewing audience, because then at the end of that, those players are going to go into test matches in that kind of November window, and I'm sure they'll be refereed to these new law application guidelines. So it'd be interesting to see what does happen when we get going again in mid-August. I mean, I personally hope that we do adopt the changes, because I think, as Cam said, it'll make the game for everybody far better, far cleaner, a much better spectacle to watch. And actually, big one, we know a lot of injuries occur around the tackle area, and if we can clean that aspect up, then we're going to help a lot of players in terms of their welfare as well.
Yeah, I suspect we will shift to that from a Northern Hemisphere perspective as well. I mean, we talk about we don't want to change much during the course of the game, but if you look at the players that were involved, all the players were out of contract in June, so they have moved clubs. So they, the likes of, I mean, Carl Sinclair's just moved from the Quins to Bristol, will be playing for a side he should not be playing for in last season's rugby. So I think I suspect the pragmatic view will come across there, but I guess we await our orders.
Well, it's just on the taking that on. I just picked up another giggle moment from Joe Lyons, which I'm going to bring in because as a former prop, there's number 3 for the show. He posed a question which just drives me, absolutely cracks me up. I'm going to bring it in now. When was the last straight put into a scrum? 1895. It just, when I learned to play at the age of the wholesome age of 21, a hooker had a job to do. The ball was put in straight. He hooked the ball out, and that was it. And the 2 props were there to push them. It's just gone this. What are your takes on that, guys? Because the next 2 things, this one leads us into the next one, are the difference between the Northern and Southern Hemisphere viewpoints on the interpretation of the rules. So, David, maybe perhaps first on the interpretation of just that example, the putting at the scrum, which drives us all wild.
Thanks for that one. Yeah, I think it's the inevitable question whenever there's a referees forum or conversation.
Really?
It's the one question you know is going to come, and I don't think anyone's got a. And I'd be wrong if I sat here and said I've got a definitive answer as to why. Yeah. And I don't think anybody can honestly say why, apart from if you look at the mechanics of the scrum in the modern game at the highest level, because that's what people are talking about. I don't think it's the problem at community rugby level. The games that I see and I've refereed and players I regularly see, it's not a problem. The ball goes in, the hooker still does his job, and everybody gets on with it. At the top end, the mechanics of the scrum, from a referee perspective, there's so many moving parts that actually the putting becomes almost like in your pecking order, it's probably 3rd, 4th, 5th. You look at other things before you even get to that point. And by the time you get to that point, the ball's in the scrum and the ball's gone. And you say, well, let's crack on then. And then the other aspect is, and you talked about it in your intro there about props and hookers. There's very few hookers and props now. They're actually set up on when it's not their putting to do anything other than just try and push. Yep. They're not going to try and win the ball on the strike like the good old days and get one against the head and take that into the bar and have a few pints over it. So there are some, if you like, game shifts that have moved that from a game playing perspective lower down the pecking order. I accept it's not right. I accept that, but I just think when you look at the whole package put together, that's where you'll probably find most top referees will say that's why we let the ball be put in crooked, as people say. But don't forget as well, the law changed a couple of years ago where the scrum half could stand slightly to his right and put the ball effectively under his own hooker, so you've got no chance of getting the ball anyway. So even
so I was waiting for that. I was going to chip in if it didn't come. I've said this before with you, Joe, and I've said it on the site and on the Advantage Over podcast, which you might want to listen to. But look, I actually think we've got to get over it. So was it Joe that said it? Get over it, mate. The law changed 3 years ago. The scrum half can stand to his side and put it in. It doesn't matter. He can put it in straight, and he does put it in straight. The hooker has to strike. And the view that Rosie and I get, we see a lot of put-ins, and there is always a strike. So it's happening. The game gave up on it 3 years ago. We didn't do that as referees. The lawmakers changed the law to move the scrum half. So that was the point where it was stopped being an issue, and we've just got to get on with it.
Yeah. So that then does lead us on to, now it's a great bit of crack eyes, but it is a serious point. But it does lead us on to looking at the time frame there. The time has flown by. The fundamental differences between northern and southern hemisphere on both as a sort of a ref manager in the southern hemisphere, former refs and TMOs in the northern hemisphere. How do you view the differences? We'll start with Cam first. Is there fundamental differences in the way the interpretation of the laws between the two hemispheres? Because there seems to be when we see different refs. Cam, would you say there is, or it's just the style of game? Because Super Rugby, for example, Southern Hemisphere rugby is so fundamentally different from the Northern Hemisphere. Is that what causes it, the differential?
Well, I'm not too sure. It's going to be really interesting to see what comes out of it now that these law application guidelines are in place around the breakdown in particular. Because I know that's probably the one area in particular that you see probably the biggest differences. But if these are sort of, I guess, aligning, and we've seen a lot more, these we probably would see maybe Southern Hemisphere referees, particularly a lot more of the off the feet or in the side things go in the past, or not rule on those in the past. That's the past now, definitely the past. And by virtue of that, you're starting to see a slightly different game. Like you're seeing in Super Rugby now, probably slightly more kicking. You're seeing drop goals for the first time ever. But even just little law tweaks, and not law tweaks, but even just little law clarification, honing in and focus areas can just change a game like that. So it's amazing what influence a refereeing does have on a game. So to say that Super Rugby is vastly different, I would also then say that maybe the refereeing and the Southern Hemisphere refereeing style has allowed it to be that as well. It's probably had an influence over the last few years, and it's sort of evolved and developed in its own way, aside from Northern Hemisphere rugby. I think I was telling you a story yesterday about the Lions tour down here in New Zealand, and I was lucky enough to meet Jaco Paper and Romain Poit and Jerome Garces, and have a good chat to them prior to the series start, and even then the difference between Jaco and the French fellas just was quite different in the application on the field. We understood Jaco's calls probably a lot more as from a Southern Hemisphere perspective.
Sure.
And then when it got to the to Jerome and Romain, it was a bit more head scratching. It wasn't necessarily wrong. I understood as a referee, but from a fan's perspective and understanding perspective, it was quite different.
Ah, cool. Keith, David.
I think there's a lot to this. I think what you've got to look at as well is the competition structures that where at the very highest level in New Zealand and the Southern Hemisphere is Super Rugby. There's no promotion, no relegation, and the way the game is played, the attitude towards the game is different when you've got a competition in the Northern Hemisphere, where in the Premiership you've got promotion relegation, which starts to contract the way teams play. In the Pro 14, you've got qualification for European Champions Cup that rides a lot. So that's really key for a lot of the clubs there, although there's no relegation, but that's a real driving factor. and I think the combination of those things alter the way the game is actually played, not necessarily the way it's refereed. And I agree with Cam. I don't think there's a huge amount of difference between the very top guys in the northern and southern hemisphere. You'll get roughly similar outcomes to similar situations. There's always been nuances. The French guys are always a little bit quirky, but they're generally on the same page, and I think that's the main thing. There will be a couple where you think, crikey, that was a bit strange. Where did that one come from? But generally, I think we're on the same page. We get very similar outcomes at the top level, and I think it is more about the playing structure than refereeing styles, as people call it.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I don't think there's much more to add from a difference perspective. I think the game has got more global over recent years. We've got the mixed panel at the elite level, so we're always seeing the Northern Hemisphere doing the Southern Hemisphere matches. The reverse. We've had some fairly good cohesion over Rugby World Cup time. Occasionally, there's going to be variations on a theme, but on the whole, the way we apply things now is getting much more globally consistent than I think it ever has been before. So I think it's one of those things. There'll always be quirks to it. The game is a slightly different product, but how we're all refereeing, I think, is getting much more balanced and level.
Okay, we got one question just before we sort of want to just cover just before, just as we come up towards the end of the show, on returning to play for oops, knocked my lights off there. Returning to play for you guys, but Boogie's put up a question there. Just a question on how you guys feel about getting rid of calling the mark. Would it make the game more interesting if defences then had to play the ball out from the back rather than calling the mark? Interesting question. Good one.
It's a good question. It certainly would. Is anyone that's not being trialled anywhere, is it?
Nope.
I don't think so. I think it's it can be trialled from now.
Yeah,
He's got here first.
Martin, as we've said, we've gone live from World Rugby headquarters in Dublin tonight. Martin is in there. I hope he hopes that Bill, God bless him, is watching.
So actually, it's saying that they haven't changed it. Australia are trialing a change, so they are they're saying you can't mark it. A 22 to 22 can't be marked. So they are sort of trying to bring then to stop that. But to be honest, the number of times it would be marked on a 22, normally there's so much space and time, no one's going to mark it anyway. So that feels like a bit of a strange one to do. But
I can't see many back three players wanting that change. Can you really? Especially if you're playing against someone like Conor Murray.
Yeah. It buys a little bit of time. I was before those things as well. Just buys people a little bit more time, doesn't it? Take the mark and just reassess, especially if you're sort of the pressure's on you a little bit there. But so to finish off, lads, the returning to play. I mean, obviously, Cam, you're already within that capacity now as developing and moving forward in New Zealand. But Keith and David, what is the systems and places for you developing your sort of return to play protocols for officials?
I know the RFU are working with the government at the moment to try and set up some frameworks to give to DCMS, as we call it, her Department for Culture and Media and Sport, to try and provide the government what they want to ensure a safe return to play. Keith's already talked about the fact that World Rugby have issued some hybrid laws that can be introduced to keep to get the game going again and make it safer. In terms of refereeing, what we've tried to do is support our referees through things like this, through webinars and through Zoom meetings to keep them keep people in touch with each other. And I think a bit like players, referees, the guys and girls want to get out and actually start contributing again and getting out and refereeing some matches, whatever those matches might be. I think we all accept that we might have a different game initially to referee before we get back to the full thing we had before the lockdown. So I think there's a lot of enthusiasm still, and I think hopefully, from what I hear, we may get some rugby around November for the community game in England. So fingers crossed that happens. And if that is the case, we won't lose too much more of our season. So fingers crossed for that.
Just imagine how fit we're going to be with a 5-month pre-season training regime to get in.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, absolutely. How did you find your return to play protocols, Cam?
Well, it was all quite set up quite well. Certainly, we had our national alert levels that guided us through. So alert level 4 was full lockdown, and alert level 3, we New Zealand Rugby worked quite closely with the government as to what could happen, and Sport New Zealand as to what could happen at each alert level. So they were always coming out with frameworks and guidelines based on alert levels as to what could happen. So we couldn't really get anything back going until alert level 2. We're currently alert level 1, so everything's kind of business as normal, but the borders are closed. But alert level 2 is when we could start training again. Every single club, any activity, rugby activity, had to have a full health and safety COVID plan. Had to be sterilizing sanitizing the equipment, and etc. Had to have full contact tracing and things like that. And then there were plans in place for numbers that could be at grounds, maximum of 100. And so the policing on that for clubs and the compliance would have been quite stressful, no doubt. Luckily, we then moved to alert level 1 weeks ahead of even when pre-season was going to start. But New Zealand Rugby always gave some dates. They were like, no rugby is going to start until, you cannot have rugby until the 13th of June for pre-season, and competitions can't start before the 20th. And that was announced 4 or 5 weeks out in advance, and always to be reviewed. So it was always plenty of, there was always plenty of foresight and plenty of plans going in place. Luckily, we didn't have to use some of the more stringent ones, and we could just be actually rugby as normal, more or less, once we actually got back into it.
I think the difficulty we've got, Joe, is that we're still mid-season. So we've still got in the north, we've got a Premiership season to finish. We've got a Pro 14 season to finish. We've got European competitions that need finishing off, so that we can park that, and then we can move on to the next version, because then we're into autumn internationals. Well, if they're going to be a thing, when does the new season start for us, and how do we kind of get back onto calendar, if you like? I mean, really, we're looking. They've already announced today. Obviously, the Lions will tour South Africa end of July next year. So there's a fixed date. There's the first fixed date I've seen for quite some time in anything to do with rugby. So working back from that point, how do we get Six Nations 21 in? How do we get seasons built around that? There's an awful lot of work to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was surprised today they came out with that. Bear in mind that South Africa has just gone backwards a massive step, stopping alcohol, and a huge step backwards. And then to announce that within a very short space time, I was surprised. But no doubt Andy Danny will be covering that on our Springbok and South African roundup show tomorrow. More about that in a minute. Listen, lads, it's there's been I do Joe Lyons. I think he's been on the Malbecs tonight as well. Good man yourself. Thanks for the engagement, Joe. Obviously a friend of Cam's, I think, but it's been great, mate, having you on the show. Please join us again. That's just the finished question on He'd Be a Bloody Ref. Well, there's opportunities even for you, Joe, I think would be the answer for everybody. Before we finish, lads, Martin Buggy, you're not asking any more questions because you are the run over king, and every single time you either on the show as a panelist or viewing, we'll run over massively. Keith, then Cam, then David, where would you like to see rugby from an officiating point of view coming post-COVID over the next couple of years? What would be the one thing, Keith, that you'd like to really see us achieve from an officiating point of view?
I'm actually going to bring it back to a structural thing. And that's part of the reason I set up Rugby Referee.net to start with, because I was frustrated with how the game supported refereeing, how disparate it was to find information and get people together. And that's kind of that's why I started what I've started to do. And it's kind of barely scratching the surface. So I think figuring out how we best support the game, we've got to get some resource put behind it, which I know is really, really challenging, and everyone wants resource. But getting some structure around it that helps all elements of the game to support each other. I mean, Cam talked about the club element and how bringing everything together. Rosie, going back to the past, where we were much more of a single game, but bringing refereeing into it so that we kind of work together to solve the problems that we've got. So that's a that's a big old manifesto pitch there. But there's a lot to it. I don't know if the others have got either view on that or something more specific.
I'll just jump off the back of that a little bit, Keith. But oh, sorry, I'm not too sure if Dave was supposed to be next. But no, I mean, certainly from a money is obviously a big factor in terms of resourcing, and I think we need to be quite smart with that. Obviously now with traditional revenue streams having been taken a massive hit with the financial situation of the world. But even so, like earlier this year. Or last year, sorry, I was on a course, a coach developers course, so for developing referee coaches, and it was with other codes. It was cross-code. It was non-code specific. So with netball and hockey and basketball. And I think there are massive opportunities to actually collaborate with other sports and pour resource into doing something well. Because if you're looking at, for example, referee coach development, trying to do it in your own little silo, I think is pointless. You don't need content's irrelevant. Content's going to come with the coach. It's the coaching skills and the process that you need to develop, and why not work with other sports and become cross-code and collaborative, and even game management sessions and communication and conflict. All those are not unique to rugby refereeing. They're match official issues. So I think we can probably get a bit smarter as well, and I'd really like to see that direction taken locally and even more at a national and international level. Just become a bit more resource to collaborate with other sports too.
Yeah, fab idea, mate. Absolutely brilliant. Dave?
Yeah, I think the lads have mentioned two really good and key things there. I think the structural one is massive, I think, for refereeing, without a shadow of a doubt. But also I think the big thing I'd like to see is taking Cam's theme there is about how does officiating become much more mainstream across and within the game, and doing so, why aren't we looking outside of our own sort of confines? If you look at American sport, the officials in the major American sports are communicating across each other continually and working together continually to develop officiating as a career, but also, notwithstanding that, also the resources that go with that, and it shouldn't be beyond. We shouldn't have the silo approach we've got, where the New Zealand Rugby Union are doing one thing, the Australians are doing one thing, the English are doing one thing, the Welsh. We should actually be looking at saying, as we touched on earlier about the North and Southern Hemisphere difference. Actually, it's one game, it's one global game, as Keith put there. So why can't we share resources that actually make that whole process far easier? Because it's the one thing in the game which doesn't have to be different to anywhere else. Because each union, each club, each team want to play different to its opposition, whereas refereeing and officiating actually has that one common denominator, which is a set of laws that have to be applied, but can be applied in a certain way. And there's lots of stuff around how we do that. So it's a long answer, but I think that's what I'd like to see happen in the next couple of years. Good
drills. Excellent. I think it's a great way to finish on. Martin Buggy, I will give you this one. Interesting show where we've got a great variation of discussion on Three Blokes Wall and Bod. The game is not about just playing at international or professional, but club level across the whole piece. And I think that just ties in with what everybody said. Keith, before I wrap up and say goodnight, tell everybody what's coming up next. Just tell us what people find at rugbyreferee.net.
Blimey. Well, at the moment, all sorts of bits and pieces. We've got regular appointments news as that's starting to come out. So that comes out every Thursday, and news as it happens. So we've got backstories about sort of content around the law changes they happen. We try and get under the skin of it. I've got the podcast as well, the Advantage Over podcast, for people who want to listen to more of my voice. Then feel free, subscribe to that. We've got some great episodes going back there about refereeing the scrum. Whether it's we've had an interview with Wayne Barnes before the World Cup. We've spoken to people from all around the world there. So it's great to delve into the episodes there to do so. We've also got a referee community group. So if you are referees there, there's about over 1,000 of us in there over on Facebook. If you head to actually refsquad.com, that will bounce you into the group, and we can carry on this conversation there.
Absolutely brilliant. There you go. See you. Big Joe Shep here. Three Blokes, a ball and bod group of online rugby shows globally. fortnightly, monthly, weekly, daily, depends what it is. Love doing these joint venture shows. Tonight it's been my real privilege to have done a joint venture show with rugbyreferee.net, and it is, and Keith is my go-to messages galore saying, yeah, thanks very much, absolutely fab show. When the lads back on again, Jeff, I should take a screenshot and tell you, like, geez, your lads are good. Rugbyreferee.net is my go-to source for things on officiating, and Keith is our go-to guy that who has been on the show lots and lots of times and will be back on again. I'm glad that 14 months on since when we first planned this, we could get an officiating show on its own right. So to do a joint venture and to get rugbyreferee.net highlighted a bit more has been the right thing to do. To Cam Russell, who is the referee manager. Refereeing is all right, but as a referee manager at the Bay of Plenty Rugby Union, who we did tag into the post tonight, so I hope the lads will be happy with that, in New Zealand. Thank you for getting up at an unearthly, godly hour in the morning and joining us, and for sharing your thoughts, mate, and your knowledge and your experience. It's fab. It's a real pleasure to know you, and I will keep
pleasure. Thank you.
To David Rose. Dave, thank you for your chat yesterday, mate. Very enlightening, and I think your journey's been fab as well. I think that, you know, what goes back to who'd want to be Joe Lyons' tongue-in-cheek question, who'd want to be a ref? These three guys here have been refs, they've been players, they've been coaches, they mentor, they come together in unity. It is a rugby family, it's a rugby club, as Camps describes as, and David's journey through all of those things as well. I think it just shows that anybody and everybody can be a referee, can be a TMO, can have some part to play. And why not volunteer at your local club and start from the ground level to be an officiating liaison officer, to go out to your local society, rugby referee society, clubs, whatever it is called in your region. Go and do a trial day, go and understand the laws a bit more, invite the refs in. So I think it was Cam or David said, in when you get back into the bar later, the ref isn't necessarily just stood in his own like he used to be. You know, he's invited across for a pint. Or your officiating liaison officer, the players can say, look, is that ref there? You know, what was all that about? And he can explain it as succinctly and as simply as the guys, our expert panelists, have done tonight. Cam, we wish you and family and the whole region all the very, very best. Stay safe, and we look forward to having you on again. Thank you, sir. David Rose, a real pleasure, and I know that you're going to be looking doing some stuff with Andy Daniel and Clarkey over on the mental health side of things as well, mate. And we wish you all the very best. It's been a real pleasure. And Keith, keep doing what you're doing, mate, because without rugbyreferee.net, you know, we don't have that thing at all levels to keep people going. It's a real pleasure.
Thanks, Joe. Good chat as ever.
Absolutely. Coming up tomorrow night, we have the Springbok and South African Rugby Roundup show, Drie Blokes, Ball and Blitz Bod, with little bottom, through Andy Daniel at Scrum 5. And he has got Angus Operman, he's got Gareth Mason on as well. So we are very much looking forward to seeing that tomorrow. That is 7 p.m. in the UK and Ireland, and 8 p.m. in South Africa. Or as ever, you can watch it and catch up via the same link. Next Monday, myself and Kigo at 8:30 p.m. and the same across the globe. The Kigo and Big Joe show. We are chatting. We are continuing our grassroots and community rugby focus, where we are chatting with the chairman and one of the key people behind London Irish Amateur Rugby Football Club. So join us for those. Everything as ever is on the Three Blokes Ball and Bod page, and contact us, send us messages if you want to be on the show, or there's a topic you want us to speak about. Tonight we have been looking at officiating in the modern game and how easy it actually is to do, or not, as the case may be. What makes it easier is when players and coaches and fans and parents and everybody else involved in rugby gets involved and is part of the solution and not part of the problem. I'm Big Joe Shep. Thank you, Keith Lewis. Thank you, David Rose. Thank you, Cam Russell. Until tomorrow night, until the next time, stay safe, be nice to one another, and remember, this is the global rugby family. Got a meal of mahogany, tag a slangafol.